In a time before refrigerators, supermarkets, or even basic kitchen tools, peasants had to get creative just to put food on the table. These weren't fancy meals. They were rough, humble, and built for survival. Meals that had to stretch across days, feed entire families, and rely on whatever the land or the forest could give. Forget spices, sauces, or choice cuts of meat. This was food made from scraps, roots, wild greens, and if they were lucky, a little fat or honey. But somehow it worked. These meals carried generations of people through famines, harsh winters, and backbreaking labor. Number 1, the eternal pottage. Pottage wasn't just food, it was a survival strategy. Picture a pot hanging over the hearth, gently bubbling all day, every day. This wasn't a dish that was made, served, and forgotten. It was a living, evolving meal. It never truly ended. Peasants would begin with a basic mix of grains: barley, oats, sometimes rye if they had it, and from there it became a never-ending soup. Every day they'd add in what they could find: wild greens, bits of vegetables from the garden, maybe a carrot or some turnip, bits of onion or cabbage. Nothing went to waste. Leftover bread? Toss it in. A bone with a bit of meat clinging to it? Boil it for flavor. Even yesterday's pottage could become today's base. The pot rarely left the fire. As the level dropped, it was simply refilled with water, stretched again with new ingredients, and kept going. It might have started as a stew, but after several days it became a whole new dish. Thicker, deeper in flavor, sometimes a little funky, but always nourishing. If you were lucky, someone might toss in a scrap of bacon, or even a marrow bone for richness, but most days it was purely vegetarian. In the winter months, this dish was especially crucial. When the fields were frozen and storage was low, the pottage kept going. Archaeological evidence even shows burn rings on the inside of medieval pots, indicating they sat on the fire for days or weeks at a time. This was the slow-cooked meal of necessity. It was warm, filling, and endlessly adaptable. The flavor profile? Well, it was earthy, with a constant base of grains and whatever herbs they could scavenge. Parsley, thyme, garlic if they were lucky. No one expected a gourmet experience. This was about staying alive. It fed the whole family, from toddlers to grandparents. It was dinner, breakfast, and lunch, possibly all from the same bowl. And while it sounds monotonous to us today, back then, it was the backbone of daily life. Not romantic, not fancy, but utterly dependable. In a world where famine was a real threat, the eternal pottage kept people from starving. Number 2, dark bread. If modern bread is a soft cloud of luxury, medieval peasant bread was more like a brick of necessity. Heavy, dark, and often sour, it was nothing like the golden loaves we see in bakeries today. Most of it was made from rye or barley, grains that were easier to grow in the poor soil available to peasants. Wheat was for the wealthy. Whatever grains they had were often coarse, unrefined, and sometimes even a bit moldy, but you used what you had. The bread dough was usually mixed with filler ingredients to stretch the flour further. Crushed beans, ground acorns, dried peas, and in especially bad seasons, things like tree bark or sawdust made their way into the dough. Yeah, tree bark. These weren't gourmet recipes, they were survival hacks. The dough would be kneaded, left to rise if they had yeast, often not, then baked either on hot stones or in communal ovens shared by the village. Families without access to an oven would often bake just once a week. The result? Rock-hard bread by day 3. By day 6, it was so tough that people dipped it in pottage or weak beer just to soften it enough to eat. This wasn't optional, it was the cornerstone of their caloric intake. A working man might eat over 2 pounds of bread a day, women and children slightly less, but still enough to account for a huge portion of their diet. Bread wasn't just food, it was symbolic. It carried spiritual significance. Wasting it was a sin. Stealing it was a crime. If famine hit, bread could become the only thing people ate for weeks, and they got creative. crumbling it into soups, frying it if there was fat, even boiling it into a bread porridge. It had to last. Even though it tasted rough and sometimes smelled a little off, it was a lifeline. Despite all this, there was something almost comforting about that dense, chewy loaf. It filled the stomach, it stuck to your ribs, and it meant you might make it through another day. In the medieval world, that was more than enough. Number 3, grits and gruel. When times were desperate, and they often were, peasants turned to grits and gruel. Grits were a catch-all term for any kind of thin porridge, usually made from coarse ground grains and lots of water. Gruel was even thinner. If pottage was the workhorse of the medieval kitchen, then gruel was its last gasp. It was the bare minimum of sustenance, grain plus water, boiled until it reached a consistency somewhere between soup and sadness. This was what you fed the very young, the very old, or the very poor. Babies were weaned straight from the breast onto gruel. Elders with bad teeth relied on it. The sick got it because they couldn't handle solid food. It wasn't seasoned unless you happened to have a pinch of salt. No milk, no sugar, and certainly no butter. If you were lucky and that word was doing a lot of heavy lifting, you might get a spoonful of honey or a sprinkle of herbs. It wasn't just the peasants who lived on gruel. Monks in monasteries ate it regularly, especially during fasts. Some even viewed it as spiritually cleansing. But for most people, it was a matter of necessity, not virtue. During times of famine, there are records of monasteries stretching a single cup of oats to feed 10 people with gruel. That's maybe 2 spoonfuls per person. The consistency was often closer to flavored water than a meal. But it was warm, it filled the stomach at least temporarily, and it gave the illusion of eating. It was also incredibly easy to make. Just throw what little grain you have in a pot, add water, and boil. No recipe required. No real skill either. You just had to make it last. It wasn't uncommon for people to complain that even the dogs wouldn't touch gruel unless they were starving. That about says it all. But when the pantry was empty and the fields were bare, a thin bowl of gruel might be all that stood between you and starvation. In a world where food insecurity was the norm, even gruel earned its place on the table. Number 4, turnips. Turnips were the unsung hero of medieval agriculture. Ugly, tough, and often overlooked today, they were once one of the most important staples for peasants. Why? Because they were practically indestructible. They grew fast, handled cold weather like a champ, and produced massive yields even in poor soil. That made them perfect for peasant gardens, where every square foot had to count. And they weren't picky. You could throw some seeds in rocky soil and still get a harvest. That meant when other crops failed, turnips kept producing. Every part of the plant was used. The root was boiled, mashed, sliced, or roasted. The leaves were chopped into soups and stews, while the flowers went into early spring salads. This wasn't just frugality, it was smart survival. In lean times, a pot of turnips could be the difference between a full stomach and an empty one. They were often cooked simply, just water, maybe some salt if it was available. Occasionally they might be paired with onions or cabbage for a little variety, but mostly it was just turnips, day after day. They stored well, too. In cellars or pits lined with straw, they could last for months. That made them one of the few fresh vegetables available deep into winter. Some villages even had dedicated turnip storage pits to ensure they'd last until spring planting. Turnips also played a role in folk medicine. Boiled and mashed, they were applied to the skin for rashes or inflammation. The juice was used for coughs. People genuinely believed in their healing properties, though whether that was science or desperation is up for debate. Were they tasty? Not particularly. But they were reliable. In a world where survival often depended on what the land would give you, turnips gave generously. They were cheap, hearty, and uncomplaining. For medieval peasants, that made them more precious than gold. Number 5, cabbage and onions. Cabbage and onions weren't just ingredients, they were survival tools. If a peasant had access to both, they had a base for nearly any meal. Cabbage was especially valued because it was so forgiving. It didn't need rich soil, it grew big. Some heads could reach up to 15 pounds, and it stored well in cool cellars or buried in pits layered with straw. It could be harvested over time too. The outer leaves were picked first, letting the inner parts grow larger. This made one plant stretch over weeks. During the growing season, families used cabbage daily, chopped into stews, boiled and mashed, or eaten raw with vinegar. When winter came, they often turned it into sauerkraut by packing shredded cabbage in barrels with salt, allowing it to ferment. Not only did this preserve it, but it also added vitamin C, critical in months when fresh produce was scarce. Onions were a different kind of hero. They grew well in almost any conditions, especially in poor, rocky soil where other crops struggled. Peasants loved them not only for their flavor, but also because they stored through the winter with little effort. Hung in braids or laid in baskets, they could last